Welcome back to The Critique. Today, we're looking at a script from early 2021 by Mr. Reagan called This is Exactly How Nazi Germany Began.
Right.
It argues the reaction to January 6th is a mirror of the 1933 Reichstag fire. It's a very bold parallel.
It is. And, the biggest structural failure here, I think, is what I'd call Schrodinger's riot.
Okay.
The central argument is just so weakened because the author tries to hold three completely contradictory narratives about January 6th at the same time.
I felt that whiplash reading through it. It seems like the script just keeps oscillating between different definitions of what actually happened.
It creates a total paradox. So you've got narrative A, which is the idea that it was a Reichstag fire-style trap.
The setup.
The setup, yeah, orchestrated by the left, the police, whatever, to frame conservative, the conspiracy angle. But then, almost in the same breath, we get narrative B, which claims it was a natural, organic event where people were just desperate to have their voices heard.
And he actually calls it a good thing.
Explicitly, yeah. And then, just to make it even more confusing, there's a third one, narrative C, where the participants are just polite tourists.
Right. They walked casually and did nothing wrong.
Exactly. And look, here's the weakness. You just can't argue that the event was a righteous, organic uprising and also argue it was a nefarious trap set by the deep state.
The two cancel each other out.
They do. If it was a trap, then you can't really praise the participants for falling into it.
But couldn't you say that's just a defense in depth? Like you throw every argument you can at the wall? If they don't buy the trap, maybe they'll buy the protest theory.
In a courtroom, maybe. But in a historical analogy, it's fatal. I mean, think about the core comparison here, the Reichstag fire.
It was an act of arson used as a pretext.
Right. So if the author wants to use that parallel, he has to commit to the idea that a crisis was manufactured or exploited. But if the people were just tourists appreciating art, like he says later,
then there was no fire.
There was no fire. There was no crisis. The whole Reichstag comparison it loses its structural integrity. The inciting incident becomes trivial.
I see. So by trying to minimize what the crowd did, he actually undermines how scary the trap is supposed to be.
Precisely. The suggestion here is pretty simple. You have to commit to one primary interpretation. You've got to pick a lane.
Okay, so let's game that out. Let's say he picks the trap lane. To really prove that Reichstag fire parallel, how would you refine the text?
Well, if the thesis is Reichstag fire, you've got to focus exclusively on the stand-down theory with the Capitol Police. And that article he mentions by Andrew Bujan about people plotting in tunnels.
So the argument becomes?
The argument becomes the authorities knew, they let it happen, and they used the images to seize power. Just like the accusation against van der Lubbe.
Which means you have to cut...
You have to cut all the parts praising the event as a good thing. You can't say, it was a trap designed to destroy us, and boy am I glad we did it. It's just nonsense.
And what if he wanted to stick with the polite tourist angle?
Then you have to drop the Reichstag fire conspiracy entirely, because that whole historical event relies on a massive, terrifying, destructive event. So, my concrete example here is an actionable cut. Just remove the section describing protesters as tourists appreciating art. It creates this dissonance that just kills the urgency of the Nazi Germany warning. You can't have it both ways.
That makes total sense. You need a unified theory of the event first. Okay, speaking of the analogy, let's move to the core thesis. The use of that comparison is so intense.
This is where we get into what I'd call the uncanny valley of rhetoric. It's the use of that absolute term, exactly.
In all caps, right in the title.
Right. This is exactly how Nazi Germany began. It creates a burden of proof that the evidence he provides it can't meet it.
Yeah, I noticed that right away. He says, what is happening now has happened before. Exactly. And he draws this parallel between the Reichstag fire decree and modern deplatforming.
And that's the weakness. It just strains the definition of exactly to the breaking point. When you use that word, you're basically inviting the listener to play spot the difference.
And the differences are huge.
They're massive. The text equates the 1933 state execution of Marinus van der Lubbe and the mass torture of 4,000 communists with Parler getting deplatformed or Donald Trump losing his Twitter account.
It's a massive jump.
It's a cliff. It sets up a totally false equivalence. Any skeptic listening to this is immediately going to say, well, nobody was beheaded. There were no torture camps, so this isn't Nazi Germany. And just like that,
they tune out.
They're gone. The hyperbole destroys the credibility of the very warning you're trying to give.
I get that, but let me play devil's advocate here. Isn't he trying to sound the alarm? Shake people awake? If you soften that language, don't you lose some of the urgency?
Not if you do it right. I'd argue you actually gain precision. The suggestion is to reframe the argument from a claim of literal equivalence to a warning about, say, directional similarity, or maybe mechanisms of control.
Okay, so how would that sound? Instead of, this is a template for what is happening exactly, what's the fix?
Well, I'd suggest a simple phrase adjustment. Change what is happening now has happened before exactly to something like, we're seeing a disturbing echo of the mechanisms used in 1933.
The utilization of a crisis to justify a consolidation of control.
There you go. That feels much more grounded. It's so much harder to argue.
Right, it shifts the debate.
Exact. It shifts it from, is Twitter literally the Gestapo, which is, a losing argument, to, is the strategy of silencing opposition the same, which is a much more interesting and, I think, winning argument.
Let's look at that section on the Decree for the Protection of the People and State. He draws a straight line from that to corporate censorship.
And that's a perfect place to inject some nuance. The author needs to acknowledge the difference between state-sanctioned torture and corporate deplatforming. You steelman the argument.
How so?
You say something like, look, while the methods differ in severity, the outcome, the removal of opposition from the public square, is the shared goal. It shows you're not crazy. Amazon isn't the Nazi Party, but you're pointing out that the result of their actions serves a similar totalitarian function.
What about the comparison between van der Lubbe's trial and Trump's impeachment? That felt a bit shaky to me.
It was. The text implies the stakes are identical. The fix is to just focus on the political theater. Don't compare the punishment, beheading versus removal from office.
Compare the spectacle.
Compare the spectacle. Argue that both were show trials designed to demonize a political faction. That tightens the logic so much and keeps the listener focused on political strategy, not legal consequence.
Excellent. Okay, so we've got a shaky logic because of contradictions and hyperbole. But even if the logic were perfect, I feel like the voice of this piece is fighting itself.
It is. And that's really the tragedy of the shift from this objective historical analysis to just ad hominem insults. It completely undermines the historian persona he builds in the opening.
It really does. The first half is citing a Smithsonian article, dates like 1933, Article 48. It's a serious, almost academic tone. And then suddenly, it's like he shifts gears and we get phrases like leftist generate for a journalist.
Or mocking Nancy Pelosi as Princess Pelosi. Or using those sarcastic voices, oh, you bad, bad man, Josh Hawley.
It feels like a professor suddenly starting to throw spitballs at the class.
That's a perfect metaphor. The weakness here is that this tonal whiplash just damages the speaker's authority. If you're talking about the fall of the Republic, about the rise of totalitarianism,
Yeah.
petty insults just make you sound like another partisan commentator, not a serious warning voice. It trivializes the very danger you're trying to highlight.
But again, let me push back a bit. Isn't this just red meat for the base? The audience for this probably hates Nancy Pelosi. Doesn't the name-calling build rapport?
It might get a cheap laugh, but it shrinks your audience. If you only want to preach to the choir, fine. But this script is framed as a persuasive historical argument. The second you resort to name-calling, you're signaling that you aren't objective.
That this is just a vent session?
Exactly. The suggestion is simple. Maintain the gravity of the subject. The facts should be scary enough on their own.
So concretely, how do we handle that comment about Andrew Boujon, the journalist?
Just remove the ad hominem. It currently says, Andrew Boujon, who is clearly a leftist degenerate.
Right.
Change it to something like Andrew Boujon, whose writing reveals a clear bias against the movement.
It gets the same skepticism across.
Exactly, but it keeps the speaker's status high. You're critiquing his bias, not his character.
And the sarcasm about the shoes on the desk? He spends a lot of time mocking the outrage over that.
That's a great place for an edit. Just remove the sarcasm. Instead of mocking it with, oh, dearest me, no. Analyze it seriously. Why were people so mad?
Because it was disrespectful, I guess.
Right, but now look at it through the Nazi Germany lens he's trying. The fix is to say something like, the state's disproportionate reaction to symbolic disrespect, like feet on a desk, signals a demand for total submission. It mirrors the authoritarian demand for reverence.
Wow, that is so much stronger.
Right?
It turns a petty grievance into a sociological observation.
And it keeps the Nazi parallel alive. It treats the audience like adults.
Which brings us to our final area of critique. We've talked narrative, logic, tone. Let's talk evidence.
Yeah, this is a classic case of right point, wrong evidence. The reliance on these lengthy personal anecdotes to prove broad sociological trends just dilutes the whole thing.
You're talking about the Hawaii story.
The Hawaii story. The author spends a really long time describing an argument he had with a rich, white leftist couple in a hotel hot tub.
It's a very detailed story. Wiping the floor with them, putting the barb in.
And the weakness is that the story feels so self-aggrandizing. It just distracts from the high-stakes comparison to 1984 and the Weimar Republic. We were talking about world history, and suddenly we're talking about my vacation argument. It shrinks the scope. It feels petty.
But he's using it to prove cognitive dissonance, to show these people can't handle facts.
I know, but it's an anecdote. It's one couple in a jacuzzi. It doesn't prove a societal trend. It proves he won an argument on holiday. The suggestion is to replace these personal dunking stories with actual systemic evidence.
So what's the concrete substitution? What goes in that slot instead?
Cut the Hawaii hot tub story entirely. In its place, use a media analysis example. If you want to prove media manipulation, show the headline. Contrast a CNN headline about the 2020 riots, mostly peaceful, with a headline about January 6th, insurrection.
That empirically proves the point.
Exactly. The hot tub story is an anecdote. The headlines are data. It proves the double standard exists at an institutional level.
You know, there was one detail in that story I thought was good, though. He brings up General Flynn and the pressure the FBI put on his son.
That's a valuable point. It just needs to be rescued. It's buried in the vacation story. So the actionable step is to integrate the Flynn example into the main body of the script.
And how would you frame it?
You use it as a direct parallel to the Nazi coercion of Van der Lubbe. The script mentions the Brown Book earlier, how the Nazis used leverage. So you connect Flynn to that. You argue, just as the Nazis threatened families to secure compliance, we see allegations of the FBI threatening General Flynn's son to secure a plea.
That ties the modern example right back to the historical theses. Much tighter. So a key theme running through all of our feedback today is just consistency.
Absolutely. We're looking for a straight line from the historical data to the modern conclusion, without all these distractions.
So to recap, we have 4 main actionable steps. First, align the contradictory narratives.
Decide if it was a trap or a protest. It can't be both. And if it's a trap, stop calling them polite tourists.
Second, qualify the historical analogy.
Right. Move from exactly to something like mechanistically similar. Don't fall into the trap of literalism.
Third, elevate the tone.
Yeah, drop the leftist degenerate stuff and the sarcastic voice. If you want to be treated like a historian, you have to sound like one.
And finally, replace personal anecdotes with systemic evidence.
Swap the hot tub story for media now and rescue that General Flynn point to support the historical parallel.
We invite the listener to take these structural edits, focus on the forest of the argument, not the trees of the insults, and submit the work again. There's a core argument in here, but it really needs to be excavated.
Indeed, the history itself is compelling. It doesn't need all the embellishment.
That's all for this critique. Keep writing.